Please be seated. You may continue.
I want to go back to a few things. Investigate.
One of the jurors would like to get your attention.
I didn't know if it was possible in the future, if like the interviews are a little hard to make out. I didn't know if
Okay, just so you know that has come into evidence, and you will be able to take it back with you into the jury room, and you'll have a way to go ahead and play it. Okay? Does that help?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yes, you may.
Investigator Serino, just to make it clear, at about 52 minutes into that interview, the last one there on the 29th, you were playing the recording from Miss Lauer, the Screams for Help, correct? You recall that? The 911 recording?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, all right. And in terms of, you were asking, in terms of who it was, when he stated, that doesn't even sound like me. You recall that?
Correct, yes.
Okay. You were also referencing when you interviewed him in terms of that there's only 3 streets, and I'm referring now to State's Exhibit number 1. In terms of Retreat at Twin Lakes, there's 3 streets, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
There's Retreat View Circle that circles all the way around, and then there's the main one in terms of Twin Tree Lane that's right here, goes all the way from the front entrance to the back entrance, correct?
Correct.
And then there's Long Oak Way, that's the 3rd one right there, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And finally, sir, in your interview of the defendant, you showed him several photographs, including the photograph of the phone, photograph of victim, etc. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. If I may approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
State Exhibit 94, is this one of the photographs you showed the defendant?
Yes, sir, I believe so.
If I may publish that to the jury, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
I'll object, Your Honor, at
Oh.
this point. I don't see any here or at the bench.
At the bench.
Is this one of the photographs you showed the defendant?
Yes, it is, sir.
Okay, and is that a medical examiner photograph showing the gunshot wound to Trayvon Martin?
Yes, it is.
Was the purpose in showing this photograph to the defendant to show how skinny, as you stated in the recording, Trayvon Martin was in comparison to the defendant?
One of the purposes, yes.
And does that photograph accurately depict how skinny Trayvon Martin was?
Yes, it does.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Cross.
Yes, if I might.
I'm going to turn this down unless you need it.
Good afternoon, officer.
Good afternoon, sir.
How are you?
And how are you?
To set the stage, and I know that you had testified to some of this, though not all of it, in your direct examination. You became the chief investigating officer whose responsibility was the entirety of this case, correct?
Yes, sir.
So that you were the one who looked at what was done on scene, decided what else needed to be done, tasked that out to the other people who would assist you, and basically led the investigation down the path that it was to go.
Yes, sir.
And in doing that, you've assigned different tasks to a number of different law enforcement officers, correct?
Yes, sir.
Gathering evidence was one task that you put out to other officers, correct?
Yes, sir.
Interviewing additional witnesses and sort of setting the stage to get all of the information available that you could, correct?
Yes, sir.
And once you would gather that information, then you would put that together, talk about it with your team. That included everyone up to the chief of police, Bill Lee, correct?
Correct.
And it even included members of the state attorney's office, the 18th Circuit State Attorney's Office, right?
Yes, sir.
It was all part of the investigative team that you were basically in charge of. I won't say that you were in charge of the chief of police, but within the context of this investigation, that you were running that team in order to come up with everything that needed to be done to move this case forward.
Yes, sir.
Okay. You haven't testified to virtually any of that yet, though, have you? You haven't testified to the tasks that were given out to the different officers. You haven't testified to your coordination of all that information coming back together, have you?
As to the methodology of the case, no, I haven't.
Basically, the only thing you've testified so far is the statements from my client.
Correct, yes.
Okay. And let's talk about those statements for just a minute. As you first talked to my client, and I'm not going to test your memory too much, but can you give me the timing? We know this event happened on the 26th of February 2012, about 7:15. When was the first time that you spoke to my client?
At about 5 after midnight on the 27th.
Literally 6 hours after the event happened, correct?
6 hours, 5.5 hours. Yeah.
Okay. And at that point you knew, as was just testified to before you, that he'd been interviewed by Officer Singleton, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you had that information available to you, correct?
Yes, I did.
You also had the benefit of all of the other information, at least that which was gathered between 7:15 and midnight from Sanford Police Department, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you had been working a lot that night talking to witnesses and interviewing people, correct?
Yes, sir.
One of those people that you interviewed was the what we call the eyewitness. I'll ask if you call him the eyewitness, John Good.
Yes, sir.
Remember speaking to him?
Yes, sir.
And he was the one person who actually had eyes on what happened between Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman that night.
Yes, sir.
And you had the benefit of that interview with you as you first talked to Mr. Zimmerman.
Yes, I did.
So when we look at your interview, various interviews with Mr. Zimmerman, is it fair then for the jury to take it in context that you had a lot of information to you at midnight that Officer Singleton did not have?
Yes, sir.
Matter of fact, as I think she testified, she had virtually no information available to her at that point, did she?
From what I know, no, sir.
Right. But you had talked to John Good and several other eye or ear witnesses, correct?
Yes, I had, sir.
Had gathered a lot of that information together either yourself or by tasking other officers who then reported to you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And with all of that information sort of as a foundation, you were then able to talk to George Zimmerman and have him walk you through what he perceived to have happened, correct?
During our first interview?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, speaking to the one now at 12:05 a.m. on the 27th, 6 hours after the event.
Yes, sir.
So as we go through it, or as the jury listens to it again, they should keep in mind that when you sort of short-circuit through some of the facts with Mrs. Zimmerman, it's because you already know them from other witnesses, correct?
Yes, sir.
You had talked to Officer Singleton, and she had sort of downloaded onto you the substance of the conversation or interview that she had with Mr. Zimmerman, correct?
Briefly, I spoke with her, yes.
Okay. I'm going to go through the February 27th interview with you, but I'm going to ask you first, so that when we go through it, I want you to highlight it for the jury, if there were any significant differences that existed between Officer Singleton's interview several hours earlier and your interview at midnight on the 27th, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Did you notice any significant differences that caused you concern based upon your years of experience as an investigator?
Not immediately, no, sir.
Okay. For example, you had to focus on how the two people first got in contact with each other, correct?
Yes, sir.
And do you recall whether or not you had listened to the non-emergency call by the time you talked to Mrs. Zimmerman the first time?
At that point, no, sir, I had not.
You had not. But you questioned Mr. Zimmerman about whether or not he had followed Mr. Martin, correct?
On our first interview,
Yes.
I may have. I'd have to check the transcript.
Yeah, and I happen to have a partial transcript here. If I were to tell you that you said you reported a suspicious person, he said yes, sir. You said you followed him, and he said yes, sir.
Yes,
he
sir.
acknowledged to you that he at least followed and kept an eye on Trayvon Martin, did he not?
Yes, he did, yeah.
Was that anything that concerned you?
No, sir.
Okay. You didn't at that point have the benefit of the non-emergency call where the operator asked 2 times in succession, what's he doing now, or words to like effect?
No, I had not.
Okay. Did it seem to you that you did not have that, I'm sorry, you did not have that benefit of that
No.
transcript?
No, sir.
Okay. And you also asked him whether or not he had lost visual of the person, correct?
I think I stated to him that he did. I was summarizing what I had known that he had said already.
Because that had come from the Singleton interview, correct?
Correct.
Any concern with that?
No, sir.
And then you had told him at the beginning of the interview that you would like to do a walkthrough or a recreation the next day, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, we've had Officer Singleton testify to this, but obviously he was Mirandized, correct?
Yes, he was.
And affirmatively waived that?
Yes, he did.
And you knew and you had advised him that had he wanted to stop the interrogation at any point, that that was his right?
Officer Singleton did.
Okay. And he never stopped the interview, did he?
No, he did not.
Always was willing to answer all of your questions?
Completely.
Matter of
yes.
fact, I think it was at the end, of course, you stopped the interview, Rhett, and said that at
Yes,
that
sir.
point you had other things to do with the investigation.
Yes, sir.
And it was briefly, or just a quick check-in with Mr. Zimmerman at that point to get some questions answered, right?
Yes, sir.
And in any of this interview with you, and we're going to go through each one with similar questions, did he evidence any anger or disdain towards Mr. Martin?
No, sir.
Did Officer Singleton even tell you that he wasn't aware that Trayvon Martin had passed away until she told him?
I can't recall, sir.
Okay. The story that Mrs. Zimmerman spoke to you about, and I know that we're going to get into some other interviews that went on later, was there anything in that interview that at the point, well, let me back up, I'm sorry. He was in police custody from the time that Officer Singleton interviewed him until the time you did, correct?
Yes, he was.
And he did not have his cell phone available, did he?
I don't believe so. No, he
Right.
didn't.
He did not have any access then, did he, to the investigation that was ongoing back at the scene?
No, he did not.
So would you agree then that he was unaware of anything that you had discovered as what had happened at the scene?
I could safely assume that, yes, he was unaware.
I used the term that it was sort of a virgin interview, the one that he had with Singleton, right?
Yes.
First time anyone got to him, and that's a police technique, isn't it? You want to get to a shooter, a person who is at least a person of interest, as soon as you can, correct?
Yes, sir.
Before they are infected by additional information, correct?
Yes, sir. We refer to that as locking him into a statement.
Locking them in, okay. What's the reason for that?
So the information that he provides can be as pristine as possible without being contaminated by outside influences.
Exactly. One of your primary goals as an investigator is to make sure that whatever evidence you can get and keep, as you say, pristine is the way you want to do it, right?
Yes, sir.
That includes pieces of evidence, correct?
Yes.
Which is why we use gloves and forceps and bags and evidence tape to make sure it all stays pristine, right?
Yes, sir.
And it's also why you want to make sure that witnesses stay away from each other. You actually separate them, don't you, so that they don't get a chance to hear what the other one's saying?
Under best circumstances, yes, sir.
Yeah,
That's preferred.
And why do you do that?
It's preferred to keep it pristine, to keep each individual testimony individual.
Right. Because if there are going to be differences in the witnesses' testimonies or statements, you want to make sure that they stay apart from each other so not to sort of collaborate on what they say happened.
Correct.
Whether that is intentional or just a byproduct of hearing what the other witness says, correct?
Correct.
So, in this interview process, Officer Singleton had first shot at Mr. Zimmerman and got that and documented it, correct?
So to speak, yes.
Yeah. And then he was kept separate and apart from the investigation so that your interview with him was also as pristine as you could keep it, correct?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that it was in fact pristine, that he was not infected with any additional information?
Yes, sir.
Okay. That information that you had gathered, though, included information that what John Good had told you, correct?
Yes, sir.
So you were armed with the information of the statement of John Good, which was...
Overruled.
You were armed... You were already the chief investigator at this point, right? It was assigned to be your case?
Yes, sir.
Your responsibility is to find out what all the other witnesses say?
Yes, sir.
So that you can incorporate that into the next witnesses you talk to as best you can?
Yes, sir.
That's what you do, right?
Tie it all together, yes, sir.
Sure. And in tying it all together, when you went to Mr. Zimmerman during your first interview with him, you had information from John Good and a number of other witnesses, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that interview from John Good that you had available to you, you used when you were questioning Mr. Zimmerman, correct?
Yes, sir.
Of course. You knew that John Good had said... So, Investigator Serino, you had the information available from John Good, as well as other witness statements when you had this interview with Mr. Zimmerman, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you had talked to other ear witnesses, or at least read statements that other officers had gathered together of other ear witnesses as to what they heard, correct?
Yes, sir.
That included Ms. Lauer, who told you she heard what she heard,
Yes, sir.
correct? And her fiance as well, back then her fiance, right?
Jeremy Weinberg.
Yes.
Yes.
You had spoken to them yourself, I believe?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So, as you were now going back to Mr. Zimmerman, who did not have this information available to him, tell me what concerns you had with what Mr. Zimmerman told you that night that did not comport to the evidence that you were now aware of.
I had none at that time.
Okay. Did he seem to be cagey in his answering to you? Did he seem to be sidestepping your answers in any form or way to get around answering your direct questions?
No, sir.
Did he seem to do anything that, based upon your training and experience, evidenced to you that he was being less than straightforward with you?
No, he was being straightforward, in my opinion.
I think it was in this interview that you talked to him about the anxiety and nightmares that he was going to have because of this event.
Yes, sir.
What do you mean by that?
Well, based on my experience, people who experience traumatic type scenarios like he went through, they typically end up with anxiety problems. He appeared to be lacking, in my opinion, as far as what was going on, what he was in the middle of. It just seemed that something was going on with him.
Would you call that, sort of in generic terms, a real flat affect or affect as to what was happening?
Generic terms, yes.
Okay. Did that cause you concern that he had, in fact, gone through a traumatic event and his response was a flat affect about it?
To some point, yes, it did.
Okay. You even said to him, you're going to be anxious, you're going to have nightmares, I'm going to get you some help, right? Didn't you say that to him?
Yes, I did.
What help did you mean that you were going to get for him with what he had gone through?
Any kind of medical attention, medical attention if needed, and that would have branched out to whatever he might have needed himself.
Sure. Psychological intervention, maybe?
After a medical exam, perhaps.
Okay. You have not had to draw your weapon and shoot and kill anyone, have you?
No, sir, I have not.
Okay. But certainly you know fellow officers who have?
Yes, I have.
And it is from that experience that you understand what may happen to a person who has had to shoot and kill somebody?
Objection is to similar situation, unsimilar situation. My objection is to relevance.
Sustained.
May I at least be heard as to the relevance?
It's not relevant what may have happened to other people in other situations.
Yes, Your Honor. Whatever your life experiences have been, it brought you to the interrogation room that night with Mr. Zimmerman suggesting to him that he was going to have anxiety and nightmares and that you would do whatever you could to help him with that, correct?
Yes, sir.
Was he cleaned up by the time that he got to you?
Yes, he was.
Did you see what he looked like at the scene?
I had seen the picture that Officer Wagner had taken of him prior to.
Okay, of course, the witness, Your Honor. Just so we're clear.
When we approach the bench, I have the same objection that was
Just one second.
Yes.
Yes, you may.
Officer Serino, we had talked about the trauma of having to shoot somebody. Did you also acknowledge to Mrs. Zimmerman that part of the trauma was him getting the injuries he had sustained, getting beat up the way he did?
More so than the shooting incident, correct?
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me, with that in mind, let me just show you what the jury has seen now and is already in evidence, and ask you, is that some of what you're talking about, the trauma that Mrs. Zimmerman had gone through? And of course, you didn't see.
That's a trauma he displayed on the night of, correct?
Right. This was the picture that you saw that Officer Wagner had taken of him, correct?
Yes.
You didn't see Mrs. Zimmerman live in this condition because he had been cleaned up?
No, I had not.
And similar to this photograph, remember that photograph?
That's the one that John Manolo showed up.
Yes.
I hadn't seen that before.
Okay. Is that part of the trauma that you were talking about he had gone through?
So I think more specifically the fearing for his life trauma that he was expressing, more than the actual physical injuries, if I may. Yeah.
And it is that or a combination of that that led you to this thought that Mrs. Zimmerman had sort of a flat affect about everything that had happened to him that night?
Yes, sir.
Did it come across to you, though, that he was just uncaring, that he just didn't care that he had gotten beat up and that he had to shoot somebody because of it? Or was it truly your thought that he was reacting to the trauma?
I didn't know him prior to this. It would be included to one of my concerns, yes. However, it could be something totally different. So that was one of the concerns that may have been, that he was uncaring or other things were going on.
In the investigation, did he come, in the interview, and we're talking now about the one that happened at midnight, did he seem to be cavalier or uncaring in the way he answered your questions?
Not necessarily.
Anything in the interview that you would point out to the jury where you thought he was acting cavalier? And by that I mean something like, can I go home now? Or are we done here? Or there's a midnight movie I want to catch. Anything like that showed up in that interview?
Other than potentially making himself unavailable for next day follow-up because he had to go to class.
Right. Okay, let's talk about that for a minute. You asked him about doing the interview, the recreation the next day, right? You asked him what time you get off, and he told you, I have class at 6:30. He also told you, I think the next sentence was, but I can skip it?
He may have.
Let's say that that's what the transcript shows. If he said that, does that then address your concern that maybe this guy doesn't care much about the investigation because all he wants to do is go to class?
I wouldn't specifically go there about the whole thing, but it just appeared odd that he had that on his mind based on what just happened to him and what had ended up happening out there. It struck me as being different.
Does that fall in line with your concern that he had this flat affect, that he just wasn't reacting to what he had just gone through, both in having to shoot and kill somebody and in getting those type of injuries from the beating that the incident that he said happened to him?
Among other things.
Okay. Was it also as concerning to you that he just said, I got to go to work in the morning? After it was midnight, he was still with you, and yet he's planning to go to work in the morning.
That was a little concerning.
Okay. And again, concerning if, in fact, he was completely uncaring?
Uncaring, among other terms.
Yeah, but not a concern if it was just further evidence of his reaction to the trauma being just going flat on things.
Correct. I mean, hard to say.
Right. But aside from the fact that he seemed to be acting with his flat affect, There was nothing in his words that suggested an uncaring attitude, was there?
No, there weren't.
Matter of fact, Investigator Singleton told you that he didn't even know that Trayvon Martin had passed, and when he had passed, they had a conversation about God and being Catholic, and that he put his head down and shook his head no when she finally told him that Trayvon Martin had passed. She told you that, right?
I don't recall that conversation, but she may have.
Okay. Did anything at all, and I want you to really drill into it, and I'm sorry, I know that you've heard it. I have a transcript of the interview. Would that assist you as I ask you some questions about the interview?
If you have an extra copy, I might have one myself.
Up to the state, if I might. Let me show it to the state first. It's not the official court reporter's transcript, but it may be used to refresh your recollection. Yes. Have this marked on if I might.
Marked for identification from Defense Exhibit double G. Double I. Oh.
Am I approach the witness?
Yes, you may.
I'm not going to have you go through it line by line at all, but basically to use it to refresh your recollection to the extent that we need to.
Okay.
I don't think it's appropriate. So the question is this, and only refer to that document if you need to refresh your recollection. Was there anything in the interview with Mr. Zimmerman on February 27th at 12:05 that was specifically contradicted by the evidence that you had available to you at that point?
No, sir.
As an example, he said he shot once. There was only one shot fired, correct?
Correct.
He said that his head was being hit where it was, and John Good said that they were in that same location. He even told you that
That's the hearsay again.
It's the same.
the witnesses that talked to you about the facts of the event, none of those facts presented by those witnesses contested Mr. Zimmerman's rendition of the facts, did they?
Not at that point, no, sir.
Including witnesses who were right there after the shooting had occurred that saw Mrs. Zimmerman, correct? There was no conflict there, was there?
No, sir.
There was no conflict with the initial investigation officer who came on the scene. I think it was Tim Smith. What he told you did not conflict with what Mrs. Zimmerman had told you, right?
Not at all, no, sir.
One fact anywhere in that interview that was contested by a fact that you knew from the investigation?
None that I found.
Thank you. Then, if I might retrieve the document. And then if you would remind the jury the next time you had contact with Mr. Zimmerman.
Probably over the phone prior to meeting with him on the 29th.
Okay.
I'm sorry, the next day, I'm sorry, the walkthrough.
That's okay. I was going to remind you.
Later on the day, yeah.
You had contact with him the next day when he came and met with you to do the walkthrough, correct?
Technically later the same day, yes, sir.
Okay. And of course, that's the video that you were here for.
Yes,
right?
sir.
So, he went to work that day, it seemed, because he waited until you got off work, correct?
He made our appointment. I don't know if he went to work or not, but
Okay. And he was willing to do the recreation still, correct, as we saw on the tape?
Yes, sir.
Any concern with doing that?
No, he was
All right.
available.
Did you notice a similar behavior, this, we're calling it now this flat affect behavior, even in the video as well?
No, he was a little more animated.
A little bit more resolved?
You could use that word, I guess.
Okay. And focus on the recreation, and let me ask you to point out for the jury inconsistencies that you noticed. I'm going to ask you for two types. The first is tell the jury the significant inconsistencies between that recreation video and what he had told you the night before. Right, let's just start there.
Okay. My interview with him, let me clear this up if I may.
Certainly.
Was a brief overview of what I had, and it wasn't an extensive interview. I can attest to what the interview with Officer Singleton and the walkthrough was based on what I saw. That'd be more fair. I kind of went in there to move things along because I was kind of focused on trying to identify who the decedent was at that time.
Who what?
I was more focused on trying to identify the deceased at that point.
Right.
So the interview with him was rather short, if you can call it an interview, but I'll try.
Okay, but the one talking about the interview at midnight you're talking about, correct?
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
But that's where you had at that point, and let me open up the comparison for a moment to say, I also want you to tell us of any discrepancies in the recreation video that existed either in your interview with him at midnight or investigator or officer Singleton's interview with him at 8 p.m. that you had available to you. So as the investigating officer, you've looked at, I'm not going to talk about the other evidence yet, we're going to get to that in a second, but just my client's statements to either Officer Singleton or you the night before and the differences that you noticed in the video.
Okay, sir.
Okay, that's my premise question. So tell me, what are those?
I can't think of none offhand. None specific, none that come to mind right now, no.
Okay. Obviously, you had an opportunity to review all of this information well before today, correct?
Yes, I
I
did.
mean, you were studying this from the 27th until I think at least March 12th or thereabouts, correct?
I've been studying it, yes.
And that included all of the information and reviewing all of his statements and comparing them, correct?
Yes, but when you say inconsistencies, I can tell you as far as a statement saying they fell as soon as he was hit once.
Sure.
I mean, it's,
Well, let me premise it with this then. In a situation like this where you have what you believe Mr. Zimmerman went through, both parts of that trauma, and multiple interviews of him, would you expect that there are going to be some differences?
Absolutely.
And why is that?
Because we're not robots as people. I mean, not knowing him personally, I don't think I've ever heard of somebody remembering step by step exactly how stuff occurred that they were involved in, unless you're looking from the outside looking in.
Matter of fact, if someone were to come to you and have the exact same story down fact for fact and word for word, sentence for sentence, each time you talk to them, what would you think about that person's honesty or veracity?
Either they're being completely honest or completely false to an extreme.
If you, as a cop on the street, came upon somebody and asked them 3 different times, 3 weeks apart, what happened, and they came up with the exact same story, wouldn't you think they were lying to you each and every time?
It's hard to say. I'm a professional skeptic. It's hard to say.
I guess it's sort of job security being a professional skeptic, right?
It's a job requirement more.
Yeah, requirement, I guess. Okay. So in your interviews continuing as they were with Mr. Zimmerman, you would expect that things are going to change over time, correct?
Potentially, yes.
You would, and if they were to change in significant ways, if he were to add in some brand new fact or truly change direction, you would note that, correct?
Yes, sir.
Because that would in fact suggest a change not just in the presentation but in the real substance of it.
Yes, sir.
And you're attuned to look for those as the investigator in this case?
Yes, sir.
And did you notice anything to bring to the jury's attention today that caused you that concern, that spidey sense that something's going wrong with what he's telling you?
Nothing I can articulate, no, sir.
Matter of fact, as we look at that video, as you looked at it, it was quite consistent with what he had told you before, correct?
Yes, sir.
And though it was longer and more was discussed, there was nothing in that recreation where he moved things around or did things differently or suggested things happened in a different location, did he?
Nothing major, no, sir.
Now, let's talk about, and we're building up to what I call the challenge interview. I know that's next, but let's stick on this one, the recreation interview. Okay. You, of course, had some more information. You had another day's worth of an investigation, right? Because you were working the case the entirety of the 27th, right?
Yes, sir.
So you had been gathering more witness statements and more of the law enforcement workup that was being done, correct?
Yes, sir.
Would you agree you probably had a dozen or 15 witness statements available to you on the 27th?
Approximately.
Right?
Somewhere there.
And had reviewed all of those in planning for your next communication with Mr. Zimmerman?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did what he say on the recreation video contradict any of the witness statements that you had gotten so far by Friday, or sorry, the 27th at 5 p.m.?
Nothing directly.
Anything at all that you can explain to the jury where you looked at it and said, this piece isn't fitting?
Nothing as far as the information that he had given us, no.
Would you agree that any of the slight inconsistencies that did exist on that video you would sort of assign as just being the way interviews go?
Perhaps, yes.
Well, anything else besides that?
Nothing that comes to mind, no. As far as something that would have triggered something more than just me continuing to talk to him.
Okay. Because at this point, you had fairly specific evidence that Mr. Zimmerman was acting in self-defense that night, correct?
I had information that would have supported that, yes, sir.
Well, you had his injuries, for one, correct?
Correct.
That certainly fit into your formula, did it not?
Yes.
You had a bunch of witness statements, including John Good, correct?
Yes.
And that fit into the self-defense theory that you were looking into, right?
Yes.
Part of your job is to investigate crime, right? I mean, pretty much most of what you do.
Yes, sir.
And in the context of investigating crime, you also, by nature, have to investigate the existing defenses, right?
Absolutely.
You are charged with the responsibility of looking at an event like this and determining whether or not self-defense exists.
May we approach the bench regarding this issue?
Yes. We have to take up a short matter outside your presence. If you'll please put your notepads face down and follow Deputy Jarvis back into the jury room.